Okay, so before we start today's React workshop, can I just ask everyone to download Node.js onto their computers? So I'll just give you the download link real quick. So you guys can use that link to download Node.js. So we'll be using that for today's workshop. And while we're doing that, let me just share my screen and give a quick introduction to React and web dev. Yeah, so today's workshop is about React, which is essentially an introduction to front-end web development. So first of all, what is web development? I guess in a nutshell, web development is JavaScript and HTML code that runs on your browser that we sort of develop. So the HTML part defines the layout of the website, while the JavaScript provides the logic for website interactions. And for the Node.js version, just follow the latest one. So latest stable version, I think I'll say LTS. So just follow the recommended, should be fine. So now, where does React come into play in web development? So React is front-end JavaScript library for building user interfaces based on something called components, or like UI components. So one thing that React uses is JSX, which is HTML embedded within JavaScript code. So the main concept is components. So a React component is essentially a JavaScript function that returns a HTML template. So we'll see this once we start coding later on. So what React does is it saturates that HTML template with some dynamic values, or like what we call as states, before we render the HTML. So this gives a website its dynamic nature pretty much. So a really cool concept to React is state. So what is state in React? Essentially, state in React is either one variable or many that define how a component gets rendered on the browser. So for example, if we have a website that has a clock component that shows the time, then that clock component's state is essentially the time, in which if the time changes every second, then that state will change every second. And what React will do is it will react to that change and display that new value. So every second it will display a new time for the clock. So why do we use React? Essentially, compared to plain JS, JavaScript code, and HTML in web development, React provides a lot of tools and a really abundant library to develop dynamic websites. The code in React is modulated into React components, which make it easy to maintain and reuse. And because of the modulation, we're able to organize the code much better for scalability and collaboration. So pretty much what we're gonna, as a preview of what we'll make today, is gonna be something that looks like this, like really simple. We're just touching on the basics of React. So what this is essentially a keyboard similar to what we saw on the Wordle app. So whenever we, so our keyboard will have a screen that is here, which reacts to us clicking on some buttons. So essentially, what we want our keyboard to do is for it to display whatever button we press as well as clear it. So let's get started. So for this workshop, I will use Visual Studio Code, but you can go ahead and use whatever editor you want to use. So to start us off, what I'll do is I'm gonna open my VS Code to a folder that I want to code in. So select a folder. And I want to open a new terminal session. So once I'm in this folder, because once you have Node.js downloaded, Node.js will come with npm, which is the Node package manager, as well as npx, command, which is the node package execute. So with npx, we can execute some libraries without actually installing it. So what we want to do today is create a starting React template code. So what we need to do is type npx create React app, and let's call it my keyboard app, and press enter. Okay, so also just to note, for those that are maybe struggling with setting up Node.js and all that, there's actually, if you go to your browser and search up React Sandbox, you can actually follow along this workshop or like code in React in your browser pretty much. So what we have here is this, on your left is the project structure, in the middle is the code, and on the right is the browser on which your code will, which will display your code pretty much. Alright, so I'll just wait a bit for the React app to install. It takes a while, but for me, it's finished now. So before we do anything, we need to make sure that we jump into this my keyboard app directory. Because right now we're in the directory outside of it. So we're just gonna go change the directory into my keyboard app. So from here, we want to, what we can do is let's first start our project and see like what is happening. So to start it, we run npm run start. So make sure before we run npm run start, make sure we change into our React app directory, otherwise it's not gonna work. So once our template React app has successfully run on our browser, we can take a look. So this is pretty much the base, or like the basic skeleton code when we start a React app using create React app. So let's take a look at the folder structure. So we can see that there is a public folder and a source folder. So the most important piece of file in our public folder is the index.html. So in the index.html, if we scroll down, we'll see in line 31, there is a div that is classified by the ID roots. So what React does, first of all, this index.html, because everything in this public folder gets served directly onto our browser, including this index.html. So this index.html defines, I guess, the base page that we see on our website. And what React does is it will compile or like render all the components in the React or in our source folder, and it's gonna inject all that HTML code into this root div tag into here. So we can sort of see that in action. So first of all, if we look at index.js, what we're doing here is we're going document.get element by ID by the root. So we're grabbing that root element, and then we're gonna use that root element as the, I guess, the React, or like the base React root, or like the main parent. And inside that, we will render our React component, or like our app component. So this current app component is the most high level React component that we have in our structure. And what you can see here, which is a JavaScript function, which returns some HTML code. And this HTML code essentially gets injected into this, this div tag. So if we go to the web page and then we go inspect element, and we go, yeah. So as you can see here, we have the div, the root div. Inside our root div, we have the app div, and then the header and so on. just like what we have seen in app.js. So before we move on, what I want to do is just change all this. Like we don't want to we want to write our own website, right? So go from line 7, drag all the way down to line 20, and just delete it. And then for now, let's just to test around. Let's just write the h1 tag and type hello. So for those I guess new to HTML, for every tag you open up with a tag and then you close it with a tag. The closing tag will contain a dash before the tag name, like so. And also to help you guys follow along, I'm just gonna grab out. Give me a sec. I'm just gonna share a Notion page with you guys. And what I'll do during the workshop is I'll copy and paste my complete code into this Notion doc. And so if you at any point you feel left behind, you can always just copy and paste the code and catch up. So let me just read the chat real quick to answer a few questions. They seem to be answered all good. So for example, what I'll do is I'll copy this code and then I'll print it here. And all you need to do from your end when you access the link is just refresh it, refresh the Notion page, and then you should be able to copy and paste it. Cool. Anyways, so what I've done here is I've changed the whole content of our React app to just display a h1 tag that says hello, as we can see here. So just also real quick before we move on, when we start a React app using create React app, there's a lot of stuff that we don't actually need. So I want to go ahead and delete these things. So first of all, we'll start with the public folder. So inside the public folder, the only thing I kind of want is the index.html. Everything else is like the React icons that we want to use for our website. So let's go ahead and delete these. So in our public folder, we should only have index.html. And now we move on to the source folder. So in the source folder, I kind of just want to keep index.js and also app.js. So let's just delete CSS since we're not going to go through that today. We'll delete the app test, the CSS, and all the logo stuff. Please keep everything else outside of these folders. Because especially package.json, which is needed for us to run our app. So now because we deleted a lot of those files, we just need to get rid of their references. So first of all, let's go to index.js. So we're no longer reporting web vitals, so we can delete that. And we don't need to import that anymore. And then we also don't need to import index.css. So our index.js should in the end look like this. So I'll just copy and paste that. And going back to our app.js, we don't need the logo, so we can delete that. Oh, and also the import. We deleted the app.css, so just delete that as well. So now if we go back to our web page, this is all we have, a hello text. Okay. So next, let's create our first React component. So to do that, let's create a folder in our source directory to contain all our React components. I'm just going to create a folder called components. And inside components, let's create a header component. So I'm just going to go to new file and call it header.js. So once that's all done, let's define our first React component. So to define a React component, a React component is essentially a JavaScript function. So we just have to define a function and name it as our component, in which case is header. And within our function, we want to return some HTML. So we want to go return, and then we want to open up with circular braces. And within the circular braces, we want to add our HTML. So let's just write h1 tag with the text hello. And important part is for every component we create, we need to also export it. So I'm exporting it as the default module from this file. So export default header. So now this is our React component. Let me just update the notion. So now we want to use this React component. So if we go back to app.js, we don't want to just display a h1 tag that is hard-coded into our code. We want to import this header component and render it. So from the top, we can import header from, and then we specify the file path which that component we created exists, which is within our current directory in the folder called components and in a file called header. So once we have imported header, we can get rid of line 6, which is our h1 tag, and instead replace it with our header tag. So to define to use a React component is pretty much treating it as like a HTML tag. So we can go header, and then we close it with a closing header tag. But because we're not going to add anything in the middle, there's no point in writing it a second time. So a shorthand way of writing this is essentially closing it off like so. So we type header, put a space, and then we put this dash, and then we can close it like this. So in this way, we will have our header and our app. So if we take a look, it's still the same. So that's all good. Okay, so now what I want to do is start creating components for our keyboard, the screen that the keyboard will display, as well as the individual keys of the keyboard, right? So inside our component, I'm gonna go create a new file. I'm gonna name it keyboard.js. And again, to reiterate on how to create a React component, we just define it as a function, name it as the component name. And then we just, in the function, we just return some HTML. For now, I'm just gonna return an empty div. So nothing in here, it's just gonna be a set of div tags. And then again, because we defined a component, we need to export it. Save that. And then next, I want to create a screen component. So the screen component will display whatever we type in our keyboard. Let's create a new file. Let's call it screen.js. And what we can do here is just copy all the code and then paste it. And just replace this with screen instead. For now, for the screen, what I'll put for now is within these div tags, I'll just add a paragraph tag. And within this paragraph tag, I'll just write some random text such as, this is my screen. So I'll leave it as this for now. And lastly, every keyboard has to have a few keyboard buttons, right? So let's create that component. We'll go keyboard button JS. And then again, I can just copy, all this code, just paste it. And then instead of keyboard, we want a keyboard button. Okay, now for our button, I don't want to return a div tag. Instead, I want to return the button element in HTML. So I'm going to replace this with button. And then I'm just making it the X button for now. Okay, cool. So I'm just gonna quickly update the notion with all this code. Okay, So now that we have all these components set up, in terms of like component hierarchy, what we want is we want the keyboard component to contain both the screen component and also the keyboard button component. So what we can do here is from the keyboard component, we can import the screen since they exist in the same folder, we can just go / this directory and then type screen. And similarly, I want to import keyboard button. Cool. All right, so now that we have both the screen and the keyboard button components, we want to sort of render it into our keyboard component. So all I need to do is just type screen, just like how we did before, close it off like that, and then keyboard button. Close it off like that. Cool. So as a result of all this, because we haven't actually, we've defined the keyboard component, but we haven't added it to our app component. So let's just do that real quick as well. So we want to import the keyboard from the components file / keyboard. There you go. And then finally, we can use keyboard. So before I move on, I just want to explain one thing. If we can just use this as an example. So for every React component, when we return HTML, we need to ensure that the HTML that we return is encapsulated in one common parent element. So we can't do something like this. So if we have a one div and one h1 tag, it's going to show red. And the error that says is JSX expressions must have one parent element. So at the top level, what we return has to be one element. In this case, we are returning a div. And everything else that we want to, I guess, render in it has to be within that common parent, like so. So now if we save and then look at our web page, and then we can see that we have now rendered our screen as well as a single button as our keyboard. See. So now if we go back to our keyboard component, instead of rendering a single button, I kind of want to render a whole keyboard worth of buttons, right? So in order to do this, what I want is, because if we look at our keyboard, we have 3 separate rows. So for every row, I want a variable to contain all the keys within that row. So I've pre-made the arrays for the keyboard. So I'll just tap this into the chat so you guys can just copy and paste into your code real quick. So let's do this. Okay, so what I want to do is inside the keyboard.js component, I want to define 3 constant variables. So constant we'll go row 1 is equal to the first row of keys. And then we're going to go constant row 2 is equal to the second row of keys. And then constant row 3 is the last row of keys. Now the idea at a high level of what we want to achieve now is, for every row, we want to iterate through that list. And for every character, so for every key, we want to render a keyboard button associated with that key. In order to do that, we need to make our keyboard button component more dynamic, or accept incoming values. And because React is a bunch of functions, we can do that through passing an input called props. So this props is an input to our keyboard button, and it's an object that contains all the variables that is passed into that component when we use it, and we can access it using the following syntax. So we follow up first with squiggly braces, and then inside squiggly braces, we can write JavaScript code, right? So in this case, we want to go props dots, and then so a props is an object that will contain all the values or all the import values for a component that we render. So to access a certain I guess value for a component, we just need to specify it. So props dot, because we haven't defined a value yet, what I will define it as is going to be keyboard button value, for example. Right, so after doing this, what we can do now is go back to our keyboard component. We're going to pass in that value. Because our keyboard component needs a keyboard button value, we're going to specify the keyboard button value. Right, is equal to, again, open squiggly braces so that we can, actually for this case, let me just hard code a character just to demonstrate. So in this case, I'm just going to hard code y. So I'm passing in the y character as a keyboard button value into our keyboard button component, which gets rendered into the button. And as we can see on the website, on our web app, you can see that now this button is rendering y instead. Sweet. So now that we have that set up, what we want to do is, again, iterate through each row or each list, and for every character within the list, we want to render a keyboard value, keyboard button with that value. So I'm going to write the syntax. It's going to be quite a confusing syntax if you haven't done JavaScript before, but essentially what we want to do is, I'll just go through it really slowly, but essentially we want to get rid of this first, because we want to dynamically render those values. What we're going to do is we're going to first open squiggly braces so that we can access JavaScript code, and then we're going to go row 1 dot, and then we're going to call the map function, which is a JavaScript function that runs on lists. And what does map function accepts? It accepts a callback function that callback function will call for every value inside our list. For example, let me just quickly define this function in arrow notation. So I'm just going to write it out, and then I'll come back and explain it because it's a bit weird. So we're going to start off with open circular braces, and then what we're going to pass into these open circular braces is a variable that will hold the value of these values, or like these individual values. So I'm just going to call it value, right? So for every value, we're going to run a set of we're going to run this function for it. So for example, I'm just going to comment run function here. Essentially, this syntax is going to be similar to if we define a function f1 value, and then this function does something like run inside the function. What we're defining this function as is similar in a sense that we're just using a different syntax. So the syntax looks something like this. So constant f1 is equal to value, and then this is what we want to use instead of just like space and squiggly braces. So we're going to add this equals like arrow sort of thing, and then we're going to open it with squiggly braces, and then we can write our code in here. So that's like similar syntax in a way. So yeah, so again, what dot map function will do is it will run through every element in row 1, and then it's going to call this function that we defined inside it. And this function that we defined, this map function, is going to pass these values individually as this input, and then we can access this input. So what we want to do here is for every value here, we want to return, well, we want to render a keyboard button component with that value, right? So essentially, similarly to what we do with the, each component, we just want to return some HTML. So in this case, we want to return a keyboard button. And now our keyboard button, we want to specify the keyboard button value as equal to value. So this is the value that we passed through for every item in the list. It will take this variable value, and then we can pass it into our component like so. So I'm just gonna save that real quick. And yeah, so I'm just gonna give this to the Notion page. So if you weren't able to, I guess, follow along with the syntax, you can just copy it. Give me a sec. JS. If you just refresh your Notion pages, you should be able to see it. Okay, so again, just to explain what this piece of code is doing. So for every item in row 1, we're just mapping every item with its value, and then after we obtain the value, we just want to pass that value into a keyboard button component. And what we should see in the end is a list of buttons that holds all the values within the list, like so. And then we just essentially copy this whole logic with row 2 and row 3 as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy, I'm just going to paste, and then paste. Just going to fix the indentation. And then just change it to row 2. Save that. So now, as you can see, we're now rendering row 3. All right, all good. So we're now rendering all the characters in all our rows that we defined. But you see that how it all comes in a single row. So all we just need to do is just add a line break after each row. So line break after the first one, and then a line break after the second one. So now our keyboard should look like this. So I'll stop for a second for everyone to catch up on this step, and also I'll just update the Notion real quick as well. So I shouldn't be in the keyboard button, it should be in the keyboard. Update keyboard button. There you go. So if at any point anyone gets stuck with anything, just feel free to send a chat or unmute and let me know. I'll just pause for a quick 10 seconds for people to catch up. Okay. So now that we've laid out our buttons, we kind of want, our buttons right now doesn't do anything. So we want to add some functionality for our screen on our keyboard to update depending on what buttons we press. In order to do that, we need our React keyboard component to save the state of the screen, or keep track of the state of the screen, right? Because essentially how React works is whenever a state changes, React will re-render that component with the new states. So the high level idea is the keyboard component will have some sort of state that describes what is shown on the screen. Every button is gonna add to that state or change the state by adding a new character to the existing value on the screen. And then React is gonna, it will react to the change that we've made through the buttons and display or re-render that component with the new states. So what this will look like essentially is, actually before I move on to that, I need to also change our screen to also take values from the props. Instead of hard coding, this is my screen. So just like how we did in the keyboard component, where we passed in through props and accessed a value in the props, we're just gonna do the same for screen. So I'm just gonna go props, And then instead of hard coding a value here, we're just going to go props dot value, for example. So just to see this in action again, we'll go back to our keyboard, and then we'll go look at where our screen is. Yeah, so our screen is here. So we'll just pass in value is equal to, for example, this is my new screen. So passing a value, which will be access to the screen prop, which will then be displayed inside the component. And yeah, so you can see that this is updated like so. So now we want this value to be a state. Instead of hard-coded, we want it to be inside a variable that changes according to what buttons we press, right? So in order to do that, we need to import a function from React called useState from React. So I'm just gonna explain the syntax for this useState function. So essentially, what we need to do is we need to define a set of variables. The first one, we call it, for example, we'll call it a screen value. And then the second variable is a function that sets the value for screen for this variable. So we'll call it set screen value is equal to use states and pass it an initial state value. So our use state function that we imported from React gives back two variables that we can grab through the square brackets, and the first one is a state variable, like a variable that will hold a particular state of our component, and the second variable is a callback function that we can call to change the state, so that React can re-render with the new state that we changed. And the input for the use state is just the value that we want as the initial state. So on the initial state, we just want an empty string because we don't want our keyboard to display any values unless we start typing on it, right? So let's just update this hard code with our new variable called screen value. And let's see what it looks like. So now we see that it is empty because we initiated the screen value state to be an empty string. But however, if we say, for example, pass in some text here, like type here, that gets displayed on the screen. Okay, so now I want to keep it as an empty string for now. And what we want to do is we want to pass in to our buttons a callback function that will call set screen value for whenever a button is pressed, so that we can call this value with, for example, QWE, and that should update our screen with QWE. So in order to do that, I'm going to first define a callback function. So let's just define function, and then let's call it button press handler. So what this function is going to do is we're going to pass this function into our button HTML element, so that whenever a button is pressed, it will call this function. Now, by default, whenever an event happens in JavaScript, so let me just read a question that we have in the chat. There is no limit for how many use states we can use. In our case, we're just defining one use state, but of course we can define a different use state, some other state, for example, and then set other state equals use state as one. So in this case, I'm defining a second state, and I can define as many states as I want, essentially. So yeah, there is no limit to how much state we can use. All right, so back to this callback function. So by default, whenever we pass a callback to a button element in HTML, this callback function is going to be passed into a value called events. And from this events, what we can do is we can access the target of the event, and as a result, we can also access the value of the target. So what we want to do essentially is, if we look at our keyboard button, right now our button doesn't have a value. So let's just give it a value. So the value is going to equal to props dot keyboard button value. So I'm just gonna add this keyboard button value into this attribute of our HTML elements. So this is just going to be the character each keyboard button represents. And then this callback can access that event, like whenever we click on a button, event is triggered. So this function is able to get access to that event, find the target of that event, which is the button, so event.target, and then grab the value of that button, so dot value, like so. So what we want to do is we want to call set screen value with this new button. Set screen value, and just do let's see what I did wrong. My bad. So it's gonna be a function like so. Alright, just got the syntax wrong for a function, but we'll just go events and so I'm just editing the syntax for this function definition, but essentially after we grab the event that gets fired when we click on a button, we want to access the target of that click, which is the button itself, grab the value, and then we're just gonna call set screen value with that value of the button. So what this is gonna look like is we're gonna have to edit our keyboard button so that we want to add a callback to our props, because for every button element, there's an attribute called onClick, and within our onClick, we can pass in a callback function. So props dot let's call it handle click. So now what we need to do is we need to pass in the handle click value from when we define or when we use this component. So back to keyboard. So if we look at our buttons, we're just gonna go handle click is gonna equal to, and we're just gonna pass in this callback function that we just defined earlier. So button press handler. And then we just repeat this for everything else as well. I'm just gonna save that. So let's just test that this works properly. So now, essentially, every time we click a button, we see that the screen gets updated with the value with that button, like so. So D, F, G, H. So essentially, the code is doing what we've programmed it to do so far. So I guess I'll just take a quick step back and then just like re-explain this whole process again for those that weren't able to like catch on with it. So essentially what we did was, first of all, we defined a callback function that will handle an event that that occurs when we click on a button. And then from that function, we're able to access that particular event, grab its target value, and then we're just going to change the states. In this case, we're setting the whole screen value state with the button's initial, or like the button's value. And that's why every time we click on a button, the screen is just, it deletes the previous value and displays the current value, like the value of the button that we press. So let me just quickly update the notion with this. So this is keyboard. And then keyboard button. And then lastly, screen. So now, obviously, this isn't exactly what we want in the end, because we want our screen to sort of update by adding, well, concatenating new characters onto it without deleting whatever we have in the previous state. So all we have to do is essentially change the way we call set screen value. So if we look at how we're currently calling set screen value, we are essentially rewriting the whole state value with the value of the target. However, set screen value, this callback function that React gives us from the use state call, gives us a different option to call it. And in this case, we can call it using another callback function that will use the previous state, and we just essentially have to concatenate our new value onto the previous state and return that new state. So what this will look like, again, is as the input is going to be old state. And then we're just going to define a function using the arrowhead notation. And then within this function, we want to return the old state plus the new character value. Oops. So let's save that. And now let's look at what our app is doing. So now it's not going to delete the previous state. Instead, it's going to keep the old state, and it's going to add new values onto that state, which is good. So yeah, so sweet. So because we've changed the syntax to actually input, instead of just a new value into set screen value, we are importing a callback function. The set screen value function is going to call this callback function with the old state, and within our callback function, we can use the old state and add to it some new characters like so. To finish off, to finish things off, I'm just gonna add one more button, that is the delete button, which will allow us to clear our screen. So we can just quickly do that by at the end of the first row. So this is row 1. We'll just add another button. Let's call it keyboard. Yeah, so this is keyboard button. Sorry, this is the component that we are using. And then we're gonna give the value keyboard button value. We'll call it delete. And then handle click is gonna equal to, we're not gonna use the same function handler as we did before, because we want this to have a different functionality of clearing and giving us a clean slate on the screen. So instead, we're gonna define a function that will do that. So essentially, we want handle click to be a function that will, again, I'm just using the arrowhead notation to define a function. So I'm just passing in this function within the squiggly brackets. And in this function, all I want to do is I want to call set screen value with an empty string, and then save that. So let's see if it's working. So now we have our delete button. If we press on that, our screen gets cleared and we can type again. And yeah, so that's pretty much the app that we will make today. Let me just quickly, before I wrap things up, let me just quickly update the Notion with the latest code, in case you guys didn't follow along fully. Give me a sec. See. All right, cool. But yeah, so that pretty much wraps up today's React workshop. If anyone has any questions, feel free to chuck in the chat or unmute and let me know. But yeah, if no one has any questions, I hope everyone's learned something new today. Basically, React is quite a popular I guess, framework that people in the industry use. So it's pretty important to, I guess, at least have some sort of exposure to working with React if you want to, I guess, look into web development in the industry in the future. So hopefully this was a good introduction to web development with React. And thank you all for coming. I'll wrap it up now.